Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, or good evening, depending on where you are. On behalf of Moray House Trust, welcome to this evening's panel, Shifting Power, Guyana's Energy Mix. For those joining us for the first time tonight, Moray House Trust is a private, non-partisan, non-profit based in Georgetown and dedicated to promoting the Guyanese culture and public discourse. My name is Isabel de Carries. I am the Chair of Trustees at Moray House Trust and the moderator for this event. A warm Guyanese welcome to our regulars. Please note that this event is being live streamed via Facebook. If you are on Zoom and would prefer not to be visible, please turn off your video, usually on the bottom left of the Zoom screen. A word about the format. We start with a brief presentation from each panelist. There's a short interlude where members of the panel can question each other. After this, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Please keep your questions brief. Energy is a vast topic. It encompasses markets, infrastructures, systems, services, and competing subsectors. All are in a state of transition and upheaval. Tonight's discussion will inevitably be limited in scope. Our focus is to weigh up the main options for Guyana's future energy mix. Consequently, the bulk of tonight's presentations are somewhat technical in their approach. Ms. Mangal-Joly will set the scene with an overview, outlining what factors come into play when choosing our energy mix and who gets to decide. Mr. Bhulai will offer a comparative analysis of Guyana's solar and wind potential as against the alternatives. Mr. Patterson will review the early stages of the gas to shore proposal, and Mr. Veecock, whose talk was recorded earlier, speaks about the Amaila Falls hydropower project. A word about the composition of the panel. As is customary, we invited technocrats within the administration to participate in the hope that they might offer a clear, holistic statement of strategy and policy. As is customary, they were unable to attend. To fully address this topic, we would also need to canvass opinions from economists, planners, social scientists, and so forth. So the panel is by no means comprehensive, nor is it representative in the fullest sense. It is, however, illustrative of the scale and complexity of what lies ahead. For many of us, these are some of the broad questions that surface when considering Guyana's future energy mix. What will it cost? Who will benefit? What experience are we drawing on? How long will it last? What is the wider context? To dwell briefly on each question. What will it cost? Are we really planning to sink $2 billion in energy infrastructure and at the same time upgrade our physical infrastructure with a spate of bridge and road building? What about the pressing post-pandemic needs in a host of other sectors, education, health, housing, to name a few? Are we rushing helter-skelter into all of these projects all at once? Where is the plan and the budget? Who will benefit? The map shows the population distribution in Guyana, albeit a decade ago. The red square is a generous estimate of the reach and coverage offered by the hydro and gas to shore projects. What about the rest of the country? Every single citizen will incur the same level of debt. What experience do we have? A stable and reliable power supply has eluded us for 50 years. Successive administrations have struggled to deliver even mid-level projects like hotel construction, road building, the airport expansion on time and on budget. The state has dabbled in hydro for 50 years with precious little to show for it at present. Who then will manage these huge projects? What experience exactly are we building on? How long will it last? Energy infrastructure is binding. Once the hydropower facility or the pipeline is in place, it is very difficult to shelve it or to walk away. Will Georgetown and the coastal regions, the main beneficiaries of the gas and hydro schemes, even be habitable in 15 years' time, given the vagaries of climate change and our vulnerabilities? The wider context, the realpolitik. Strip away the rhetoric and bluster, and Guyana's posture with multinational companies or powerful countries tends to be somewhat cowed. Generally speaking, we take what we are offered. We lack the experience and confidence to bargain our way to strong positions. The infamous PSA with Exxon, which both administrations are unwilling to touch, stands as Exhibit A in this regard. Ironically, this is one of the few areas of policy on which there is complete consensus across the political chasm. The advanced economies in the North are finally setting out to decarbonize their industries, economies, and energy systems. The North sets the tune to which we must dance. If gas is declared a dirty fuel in 10 years, and any goods or services produced with it are taxed accordingly, how will we respond? What is our game plan? So there is much to consider. On that note, I will hand over to Simone Mangal-Joly, who's going to provide us with an overview. Ms. Mangal-Joly is an international environment and development specialist who's worked in environmental governance at the national program and project level in 16 countries. Simone, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Isabel. I'm going to be very brief. I did include some slides in my presentation, given that we will not have the government with us, and it would have been really wonderful for that to happen. So do forgive me. Some of what I will speak to, which is our current situation, has there may be more detailed information available from other sources. So just to get started, I believe my slide is being shared. Can you see that? Okay. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to discuss not what is the best energy mix for Guyana, because I don't have the answer for that. In fact, I don't believe that we have adequate and comprehensive assessments to lead us to the point where we can confidently make the best choice in the interest of the Guyanese people. What is important are the factors that must be considered when we do choose, and who ought to be involved in deciding and why. So I will focus my discussion largely on the argument that we don't have the information, we have not considered all the factors, and we are not all engaged in making the decision and should be. To do this, I'm going to look at the general background, which is where I've inserted a few last minute slides. What is our current energy mix and options? And also just a quick reference to our biophysical and socioeconomic realities in Guyana and the global reality. I will then touch on what are the factors to consider when we decide on energy, and specific factors that are not yet assessed. It's not a comprehensive list, but it begins to get to the issue. And another aspect of factors that I will touch on are relationships between people. Finally, I will look at who decides, what international guidance do we have on this, and reference our own constitution and specific legal guidance. Because the question of who decides on something as central and significant as how our lives are going to be organized is not really up for debate. We have very clear guidance on these issues. So to begin with, a quick background, our average energy mix, as you can see there, is pretty much we are relying heavily on imported fuel, with about 7%, this number may have changed and the government would have updated figures, of non-hydrocarbon fuel sources, which would include such things as biogas, fuel wood, solar, and small hydropower. So the renewable resource base right now, if we look at our mix, our energy is largely going in, 35% is in transport. At 36% is coming from the electricity. So that's coming either from a grid, there are two main grids, or from other smaller sources. Industrial use is here, which is the orange. That's mining, actually, which I wanted to point out. Rather than industrial, mining is a very significant sector that uses fuel in the excavators and dredging operations. So quite a lot of our energy isn't really for electricity generation in terms of our demand. This is a mix of our imports, and just to show a little bit, the gas oil, which is diesel, is quite a large component of it, and gasoline, which is unleaded, is a large component as well as fuel oil. Again, the gasoline is largely not coming off of a grid for our consumption purposes. When we look at our electricity mix, 92% is coming from heavy fuel, 7% biomass. Biomass is largely fuel wood that's used by poorer communities for cooking, and bagasse. Now, there's been a kind of, with the sugarcane industry declining, there's been some issue of how that can be supplemented with growing grass. The solar right now, on the data I have access to, is about 1% of our electricity generation, and hydro and wind less than 1%. Now, what are our energy mix options? Solar, we have a natural advantage for that. We have sun, lots of it. I think this is undisputable. Lots of advantages for remote populations. There are issues with storage and also redistribution to a grid. But storage is becoming more and more possible with solar technology. I mentioned biogas. Wind, suitable only in some areas, and there are a number of studies on their way. I won't spend time on the geography of it. Hydropower, what's been on the table is mainly the Amaila Falls, but there are also multiple small projects. And of course, we are reliant on imported heavy hydrocarbons. Now, if we were to decide that we wish to get energy from offshore hydrocarbons being produced in Guyana's waters, our options are gas to shore, which is a new infrastructure. It cannot plug into our existing grid. It will have a very high capital cost up front. We do not at this time have clear proven and probable gas reserves. And there is, of course, the load of toxic pollution that comes with fractionating gas into natural gas liquids and gas for a power plant. So that's the baggage that comes with that. There's also the option to produce gas offshore. And this came out of the Japanese master plan study, oil and gas master plan study, which was updated in 2021 earlier this year. So there are apparently no main direct financial difference, but that or a pipeline, but it does give flexibility for less commitment, shorter time frames, etc. And of course, oil. We receive a royalty in crude from operations offshore. And the question is there a possibility to refine that oil and use it directly, or to have a third party refine it. I'm not going to get into any of these. I'm not an expert in this area, and so clearly that's what others are going to be discussing. A bit on the national physical and biophysical and socioeconomic realities. I have here, and Isabel touched on that, this is our human population density map. And if you just take a look at the red areas, you can see where we are quite spread out. So if we're looking at a single source grid, at least for Demerara, Berbice, or the coastal area, this is the service area that we're looking at. It is actually quite extensive. And in addition to that, there are lots of outlying areas here. So the question of how much money are we willing to spend on a single source grid if we're actually servicing the domestic requirement that exists becomes pertinent. But I will pick up on that a little later because that does not appear to be what our policy is about. Guyana, in the socioeconomic realities, we have a very high poverty rate. 41.2%, and children are really represented in that category. This is the future generation. We also have significant inequality. The top 10% of our population earns almost 50% of the total pre-tax income. And the top 1% earns 20% roughly of total pre-tax income. And that's just an insight into how economic opportunities in Guyana distribute value currently. But there is very poor data collection. This is an issue that's been flagged by the UN, many agencies, not a lot of good data collection going on in socioeconomic parameters or environmental parameters. So we're quite hamstrung when it comes to evidence-based decision-making. That is also a factor to consider as we begin to talk about what is the best energy mix for the country. Our global reality, I think, is known by most. There is a shift to renewables. Some of the cutting edge technology and the cutting edge people are in renewables. They're not in oil and gas. And the future is there. We do run the risk of being left behind the curve 20, 30 years from now, trying to go into renewables when the train has left the station. It does become a question for us as well as to whether we wish to get on top of that train and rather than just ride the end car at the end of the day. We have already seen globally the onset of extreme weather events from fires, droughts, floods in Guyana. The climate change effects are increased precipitation, intensity of rainfall, and floods that come from there. But also this with sea level rising, we are at risk for flooding from the outside too. The penalty systems are increasingly being spoken about in developed countries for getting companies and commodity chains into compliance with respect to reducing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. So there are discussions on carbon taxes, bans on products produced by fossil fuels, etc. And there is also, and I want to flag this because there's been a lot of discourse in Guyana about this clean energy and that Guyana will be shifting to a clean energy if we go for gas. And that actually, there is increasing global recognition that that is not true. Natural gas is not a clean fuel. It's cleaner than coal. It's cleaner than the heavy fuels at the burn, at the end user burn. But at production, it's extremely dirty. There's a lot of release of greenhouse gases, methane. There are times when you have to flare, there are upset conditions, and there's a lot of toxicity. So the global community is beginning to recognize this isn't really a supplement. So that covers the background. Our current energy mix, largely heavy fuels, the national biophysical and social economic realities that I think are relevant, and the global reality, just to name a few. Now, factors to consider. First of all, energy is about life. It's not about how we power our cars or how we are going to power our businesses or our homes. We're not making a decision that is self-contained. It has profound effects on everything about the way our society is organized, the economic implications, costs now, the cost to the future generation, the socioeconomic effects of distribution, who wins, who loses, the environmental, direct environmental effects of the type of power production systems that we use. So we cannot treat this as anything other than what it truly is, which is a decision about our national development. It is profoundly part of our national development strategy. And we have had widespread national consultations dating back to the 1990s on a national development strategy. We had widespread consultations on a low carbon development strategy. We also had consultations under the last administration on a green state development strategy, all of which positioned renewable energy as the future for Guyana. And now what we have in the absence of national consultation is a clearly articulated national development strategy based on increasing hydrocarbon usage and industrialization downstream. So what our national policy appears to be, and I'm showing you here an ad from the Ministry of Natural Resources for a project manager. The decision has already been made that we're going to be using gas to shore without a discussion of all the related effects of these decisions. And I want to point something out that's really important, because we are told that this approach is going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but this approach is based on soliciting additional demand. So it's not just about meeting the supply, giving a supply to the existing demand that the country has. It is also about inviting downstream dirty polluting industries to feed off that gas in an industrial-led policy. So what we're seeing here is a major, major policy shift. And I really do want to flag that. Because it's something we must consider when we talk about our energy mix. There are specific factors as well, and we can't exhaust those in today's presentation, but just to flag them, a couple of things are, what is the true cost of the chosen energy mix? What we have seen are many studies that deal with the financial, technical, and direct economic cost. What we have not seen is a comprehensive assessment of all of our options against each other. We have not seen an assessment of the direct opportunity cost, which Isabel raised in the very beginning, $2 billion. What could we do with that? And we have not seen an assessment of the indirect cost of damaged natural assets, such as toxic pollution, what happens if Guyana has a flood, working conditions, human health, what happens to the agricultural lands in and around the area. When we have a flood, we're in a toxic soup. This is a certainty, it's not a risk. We know that certain kinds of production methods come with toxicity. The second question that I think, factor that I think is important is, does the energy mix actually address our existing challenges? So we wish to transition to renewables, but we're being told that gas is the bridge. Is it? Is that true? We are told that our grid cannot take multiple distribution. One of the issues we have with solar is that you can't sell the energy back into the grid, but we're out with gas, we're going for a pretty single dominated source of energy grid again. So what does this mean? Does it mean that we're going to be left behind the solar energy curve, the renewable energy curve? What does it really mean for greenhouse gas emissions? I've looked at the Japanese study, I've looked at the studies. I have not seen any evidence that they have accounted for the production emissions of natural gas liquids and gas for a power plant. So we still have a lot of work to do before we can make a decision. In terms of supply factors, the K&M study clearly states that it's not really, we don't really know if we have the gas for the infrastructure that we're putting in. But do we know if we have solar? Do we know if we have wind? Have we looked at this in terms of the absence of alternatives. And what I mean by that is, are we doing gas because we don't have any other choice? Then finally, another factor is risks. Are the upfront costs necessary? Are they worth it? What happens when we have an upset environmental condition? What happens when there's interrupted gas supply? You still have to go back to heavy fuels to keep the grid going. So what I want to do with this is flag, there is a lot more that needs to be assessed before we can arrive at this is the best energy mix choice for the people of Guyana. And finally, one aspect of the factors that we need to consider in making a decision is our relationships. We have a human community. We're part of a global community, and we are vulnerable to climate change, but we are now also culpable and seeking to be even more culpable. The problem, what we've argued, what we've heard policymakers argue is we were not part of the problem. We didn't do it. We've had a net carbon, we've been a net carbon sink. The problem was caused by others. So are we comfortable with that as a people? Are we comfortable that we can say we're not part of the problem, so we don't have to be a part of the solution? We can binge on hydrocarbons for the next 30 years. And how do we feel about that with respect to our Caribbean country states that are vulnerable themselves? What do we think? Do we think it's reasonable to take that position? Now, I don't have an answer for that. And the people of Guyana may very well say, yes, we don't care, but we need to have the conversation. The other type of relationship we must consider is the winners and losers in this. And Isabel alluded to that in the beginning. There are going to be beneficiaries and there are going to be losers. And when we look at who benefits grossly in terms of the value generated in society, we can see that it's a very small percentage of the population. So the business community and those who can see direct benefits may not be the ones who are bearing the costs. The people living in West Demerara are bearing a cost that nobody else is bearing. The fishermen are bearing a cost that nobody else is bearing. The agricultural sector in that area would bear a cost. And what is acceptable to them, to us, remains a big open question when we start to decide what is the right and fair thing to do in the best interest of all our people. And finally, where that is concerned, our children are a huge issue here. This is about, we are making decisions that they cannot reverse. If we create a toxic energy production environment and downstream environment, they inherit it. If we contribute and not spend the money on making ourselves defensible or defending ourselves from changes in climate, and instead go and invest even more money in the cause of the problem, which is the hydrocarbon industry, we are leaving them with the legacy. If we defer renewable energy transition 30 years, we are leaving them with the decision and the problem. If we are taking out loans for all these things, we're leaving them with the debt. And are we comfortable? Is this something we want to do? Do we feel that when we choose our energy mix, this should be considered? What is it that we want to leave them for them and leave for them to have as a home and the problems to solve in the future? So just to take quick stock, I'm about to wrap this up. We've looked at the background, the current energy mix, our biophysical reality and global reality, the point that the energy decision is really about our national development strategy, the specific factors not yet addressed, though there are many more I haven't mentioned, and the question of relationships. So when we choose an energy mix, there's a lot more to talk about than is usually spoken of. Now, who gets to decide when we choose? I say we choose, but we haven't been choosing. We have been told what the direction is to date. And we don't need to fight over this. There is no need whatsoever, because it's not about the kind of issue that's up in the air. We have clear international guidance. Since Rio 1992, that conference happened, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, came about because of social movements in the 1980s that were concerned about the private sector and governments colluding to do development projects that were very damaging socially, very damaging to the broader country landscape and environment. And it is out of those movements that we had the Rio Conference. And it is since then that we have established in norm and in law and in our agreements the right to citizens participating in decisions that affect their lives. And when it comes to your national development, when it comes to our energy, when it comes to our human health, this is established. We don't have to debate this. This is not a situation where anyone can come and say, I was elected on a manifesto that said I was going to do this project, and therefore I have rights to do it without any further consultation. This is not that situation. When a political party is elected into government, they become the government. They are no longer the political party, and their duty is to all the citizens of the country, not necessarily citizens with a constituency either. And this goes back to the Constitution. I'm not going to go into the detail, mindful of time, but our Constitution, Article 13, is very clear about our right to participate. There are other elements of our Constitution that talks about our right to choose and to be involved in decision-making that affects our health and our duty to protect our environment and health. There is nothing in our Constitution that says you must have a constituency before you have this right. There is nothing in our Constitution that says the way in which you make the decision is to go and cast a ballot in the national election. No, it is about consulting, about a government consulting when it is in power. It must do it. And finally, there is clear legislative guidance, and I'm going to close on that. If you were to look here, the Environmental Protection Act, Section 17(2), I shall read it. Where any public authority adopts or alters any policy, program, or plan, and such policy, program, plan, or alteration may significantly affect the environment, the agency shall require the public authority to carry out an environmental impact assessment of such policy, program, plan, or alteration. Now, I'd like to make a very clear distinction here for the public, for those of you who are listening. This is an impact assessment of the policy, the program, the alteration that is being made in the low carbon development strategy, in all of our energy policies to date that have spoken to maximizing renewables. That is what this is speaking to. It is not speaking to an environmental impact assessment for the gas to shore project. Those environmental assessment processes are end of pipe policy. You have already assessed all your options and you have decided that you will have this project, and then you do an EIA on the very specific risks and issues pertaining to the project. So to sum up, the distinction I'm drawing here is we are required by law, even if our government doesn't feel compelled to share information and sit down and have a discussion, they are compelled by the Environmental Protection Act to consult on our national development strategy and energy policy towards maximizing hydrocarbons over the next 30. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Could you stop sharing your screen when you have a moment? Well done. Okay, we now move to Mr. Bhulai's presentation. Mr. Bhulai is a citizen of the Guyana piece of the earth, qualified in engineering, trying to do God's work. He retired in 2003 as UG lecturer in physical sciences and technology and is currently providing educational services in physics to Texela University while operating an energy services business. Now, we did actually record this earlier because the the feed from Guyana this week has been a little unpredictable. So I'm going to share the recorded talk with you, but Mr. Bhulai is here and will be taking part in the discussion. So just bear with me.
Well, I'm looking at mostly the solar alternative for what we should be doing for energy in Guyana. Mainly what it costs, and the information is publicly available. First, let's look at equipment. We know GPL has turbines. The Amaila Falls we'll have to look at the catchment area and how to make a dam, and it will have turbines. The offshore gas to onshore power will have to have pipelines through the sea, overland. Gas will have to be separated, and we'll have to have turbines to produce electricity. The solar power will need panels, controller inverters, and batteries. Three main components, plus wiring, of course. Location. Well, we know from GPL has a few coastal stations, Garden of Eden, Kingston, there's Canefield in Berbice, Breeden Hoop, and then we have in Regina, and a few other places. Amaila, there'll be one source of power. Offshore gas, there'll be one source of power. Solar, the version I am peddling is 50,000 different sources of power. There will have to be power purchase agreements. Well, we know GPL has contractors. Amaila Falls, there is will be one agreement with an operator. The gas to shore will be one agreement with an operator, and solar power I am proposing, we have very many with the 50,000 individuals. Conditions will have to be negotiated. There'll be, one operator. For solar, there'll be many different recipients. So the recipients must learn to install, operate, maintain, and must replace when damaged or worn out. Power generation. Current GPL, we've got, right now, we think it's 150 megawatt. Not all is fully ready. Amaila Falls is slated to be 165 megawatt. The gas to shore was slated to be 250 megawatt. I am hearing 300 megawatt now. Solar power, you can choose to be anything. I choose 250 megawatt to match the gas to shore. 2020 prices. Well, Amaila Falls, last price was somewhere around 900 million US dollars. The gas to shore, also 900 million. Solar power, at current prices, that's since about 2018, is about $2 per watt, which brings it to 500 million US dollars. Much cheaper than the others. Now, there is a little factor. If we, there's a power factor compensation which brings it to 250 per watt. Financing. The capital for Amaila and the gas to shore will be costly. But the solar power can be installed as we earn. There is no need for big capital. So as we produce from the economy, agriculture, and local resources, we can set up solar power without the need for costly capital. All right, consumer generation costs. This is what people will pay. Now, Amaila Falls, just for generation, should work out at, just from the 900 million, should work out at 14 US cents per kilowatt hour. 14 US cents per kilowatt hour. The gas to shore should work out at 9 US cents per kilowatt hour. Solar power, about 3 US cents per kilowatt hour. That's what it should cost the consumer. Now, transmission and distribution. That's a longish story. For a unit of electricity, a kilowatt hour, the Amaila Falls, now I'm using, if I use a standard ratio like is currently used in the United States, I would get an additional 12 US cents per kilowatt hour. If, however, I were to use something developed in Guyana, and for our situation, there is a Keto hydropower project put out by the coalition government. And using their figures, it turns out that transmission and distribution would cost 24 cents per kilowatt hour. The offshore gas, the gas to shore, would cost, with the same US ratio, 8 cents per kilowatt hour, and solar power, there'll be zero transmission and distribution. Now, when we add it up, for the total cost, GPL households pay 25 US cents per kilowatt hour currently. I'm not talking about commercial, maybe a little more. Amaila Falls would cost somewhere between 26 to 38 cents per kilowatt hour. Offshore gas would cost about 17 US cents per kilowatt hour, and solar power would cost about 3 US cents per kilowatt hour on the model that I am proposing. Investment benefits. Well, we know GPL. The Amaila Falls will have to have a big company. The offshore, the gas to shore will have a big company. We know that already. Solar power. Households. The electricity will be in the hands of many. People will be empowered, literally, in their dealing with their own energy. All right, now the profits for Amaila and the gas to shore go to big companies. And if something goes wrong, there is one huge blackout. We got to wait on it. Whereas with solar power, if something goes wrong, right away we'll know where it goes wrong. And only those people will be fixing it. Now, I've just summarized a lot of some of the advantages for solar power. It's far cheaper when we compare generation, transmission, and distribution costs. It's far less capital intensive. It can be rolled out in successful small stages, reaching people in little time instead of one large facility. Solar power, there is far less maintenance. And the maintenance is minimal. With mine, I have got solar power here at my place. All I have to do now and then, I climb on the roof and wipe down the things. But the rain does that. And dust the inverters and so forth. That's really all. There will be far more people becoming involved, learning how to install and operate. The electronics inside, you can encourage youngsters to get into it if something goes wrong. Now, there are a lot of other advantages, like education and so forth. Now, why, I'm attempting to answer this question, why does the government people keep insisting that big projects are the way to go? Well, it's a function of the prior education system. We have been brought up to think in big projects. And you go to university and you learn how to manage a big company. Big, 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 but well, and the model of a successful person is a rich one. So big, thinking big all the time. And of course they have something to gain, maybe. We don't know what deals have been made along the way. So big projects are not the way to go here. Now I'm coming to those things that you think I should answer. I've already considered the fixed costs. Karen Kemrad says what I have considered is fixed costs, fixed in inverted commas. Now the risk is high for Amaila. It's far away. It's in jungle terrain. The risk will be moderate for gas to energy. But for solar, there is very little risk. It's just whether the sun shines. But the model that I have put out can keep energy for 2 consecutive rainy days. All right, geography is a problem for Amaila. It's a little less so for gas to shore. And geography will be very favorable for solar. It can go anywhere with the model that I am proposing. Now, it affects climate change, will be affected so long as you burn natural gas. We're going to put out greenhouse gases. Amaila, the hydropower and solar would not have a great climate effect. Except, of course, you inundating an area. In 30 years' time, when the panels wear out, there may be a problem in disposing it, but I don't think that's a great problem. We can bury it. Now, the ability to scale up. Amaila is difficult to scale. Gas to shore, I suppose. It depends on how much gas you're getting and what the flow is. Solar is it's very easy to scale because it's very small units coming in when we can afford it and can go where we want it. Well, that's what I would put out for solar. A few words on wind. I have been measuring wind since in Guyana on the coast since about in the late 1990s. I had my own weather station at home and I had a weather station somewhere on the west coast. One of the things I measured was wind speeds. And I went around the coast with a little meter measuring. Some people hired me, so I did some consultancies. And for example, I went to Mainstay and measured the wind. But I never got an average of more than 4 meters per second. In fact, 4 meters per second is very optimistic for Guyana coastal wind. The Hope Beach wind farm is proposing 4.2 megawatt wind turbines. 4.2 megawatts. That's not a small thing. That's high-end, high-tech stuff. From what I have read, there an EIA has been submitted in June, we heard. And it's supposed to give about 25 megawatt. Now, that's not very significant. And it's supposed to cost about 40 million US dollars. Now, that sounds much cheaper than solar and the rest. But it's been estimated that even though the machines are rated at 4.2 megawatt each, there are 6 of them, we will not get the 25 megawatt, but only about 10 megawatt. And I feel, data doesn't come in. I strongly feel the reason is the low wind speed. We don't have the kind of wind that islands like Britain and places in the North Sea have. Places like Barbados, places like in Ireland, we don't have that kind of wind. We don't get hurricanes. It's supposed to be a blessing. We're not on the islands. So we're only actually going to get about 10 megawatts. They estimate. I think we'll get even less. 10 megawatts for 40 million works out at $4 per watt compared to $2.50 for solar. So solar is still cheaper. If we want to do wind, what I would propose is small wind power machines that you can put on your house top. And at night you can top up the batteries, top up the solar power. That is how I would. That is what I would recommend.
Okay, so that was Mr. Bhulai's presentation. We move now to Mr. Patterson, who will be familiar to most of you. He served as the Minister of Public Infrastructure in the previous administration and was involved in the early appraisal of the gas to shore proposal. Over to you, Mr. Patterson.
Good evening, Mr. Carries, fellow panelists. persons who are joining us. First, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. My remit today is to discuss the gas ashore option in our energy mix. And I will do so with a few slides. One second, please. This work. Oh, yes, thank you. A disclaimer before I start immediately is that my presentation is based on why generating power powered by solar, powered by gas was considered in the first place, and it will not be addressing any current or future projects. As Simone mentioned in her opening statement, the population density of Guyana is concentrated in a very small circle, both Simone and Mr. Carey's. And it is powered by the Demerara-Berbice interconnected system. And as you can see from the slide here, it goes all the way, starts at Molson Creek and ends at Perica. And there are several generating sets, about 6 main generating sites in the Demerara grid. In 2015, when an assessment was done of the DBIS system, it showed that the total output for all the generators connected to the system was 133 megawatts. But the DBIS system, I'm speaking from base of 2015, had several challenges. First up, the peak demand being the maximum amount of energy being drawn from the system was 124 megawatts. But as I mentioned before, the total production was 133. So therefore, we had a inadequate reserve margin. It is recommended to have between 15 to 20% reserve margin for your generating system to ensure the reliability. In 2015, there was only 8.4 megawatts. Comprising within the 133 megawatts, which I mentioned it in a DBIS, 13.7 were being produced by units which had retired, but still was in operation. And for a generator, it's generally 21 to 25 years. That is the useful life of a generator. So we had 13.7 megawatts of generating power that had retired, but we still kept in operation. And 24.8 of the 133 megawatts was due to be retired in 2018. Additionally, we had a problem, which is very well known, of technical and commercial losses. Technical losses, obviously, that's through the transmission and distribution system, the substation inefficiency of the transmission. Commercial losses, we all know that's theft, commercial theft, and they're even, they're about 50-50. So therefore, what we projected to be the issue at the end of 2020 was that 70.5 megawatts would be required. That's include additional reserve, retiring the aged and the units, as well as compensating for the technical loss, even though there'd be programs that would have been there to address that. So in 2015, with this base, along with the IDB, we commissioned a study, which is a power generation expansion study. And the remit was simple. We asked the consultants to produce a projection of what our energy demand would be like in 2035, and that was produced. And this is only for the DBIS. You can have another conversation later on about the entire country, which I do think we should have. But they projected at 2035 we would need a 330 megawatts, and the projected cost to get to that 330 megawatts. This is only for the generating sets alone, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, was $912 million US. When you added in the transmission, distribution, the other factors, it went up to $1.4, $1.5 billion. to get us to where we would like to be in 2035. Based on that, and of course, we also give the added criteria, we would like to transition as fast as possible to 100% renewable energy. So based on that, as you can see, if you look at the right, between 2015 and 2020, the consultants said to us, well, listen to me, this is what you had to do. As Alfred mentioned, we said that we will be doing a 26 megawatt solar wind farm. We would have to purchase about 40 megawatts of heavy fuel oil. They also recommended, we also said we would do some solar and some wood chips. And between 2020 and 2025, we would introduce a mid-scale hydro, which would be 150, 165. And then obviously, as we move on, we would actually try to introduce more renewable energies into the mix. So this was a part in which we took in 2015, trying to transition and to move from heavy fuel oils into renewable energy as best as possible. In October of 2016, the operator Exxon informed the government that associated gas could be available to shore. And then in December 2017, they said to us that we can have 30 million CFDs for 15 plus years consistently, or 50 million CFDs for 12 years. And you can see the gas scenario simulations which they provided to us. In addition, in about 2017, 2018, there were about 15 finds. And of the 15 finds, oil discoveries they had, only 2 really provided any sort of opportunity for gas to come to shore. That would be the Lisa 1 and 2, which is 1.76 TCF. And the other would be long tail and turbo, which was 3.5 TCF. But long tail but turbo is very much to the southeast of the country. That's very close to Berbice. And their projection is that that they would not get to that well until sometimes in mid-2030s. Armed with the fact that there's a possibility of getting gas into shore, we commissioned a company, Energy Narrative, out of the United States to do a study on the possibilities of using gas to power. And the study, which was completed in June of 2017, basically said that how transporting gas was possible. 7 million MCFDs will produce about 180 million megawatts for 15 to 20 years. We can also, there's added benefit of about 2,000 barrels of LPG per day, which is, and then of course, they had recommended a 12 inches diameter pipeline, purely on the fact that there's a bit of uncertainty as to if any additional gas will be available. So they said better to cater for future expansion if possible. And of course, the generating sets is generally about $1 million per megawatt. They provided us with a all-in cost for the offshore natural gas pipeline, which says that a pipeline in east coast of Denmark, Clonbrook area, would have been a 12-inch pipe, would have been about $344 million US. No, then knowing that gas is possible, it is technically possible, we went back to the same consultants that produced our energy mix in 2016. And we asked them to do various scenarios whereby if we introduce gas-powered engines, how can this work in the transition? And they had updated their the profile in which we adopted. We said we would do that if you could get gas in get gas in, you can address the deficit. And then, but by 2027, you must have a hydro, and then you start transitioning and move. And then at 2035, you have at least must have another hydro, as the plan said. So we said, okay, fair enough. This is a route where we can go. The studies showed that that if we adopted this route by 2023, if we started it exactly on time, we would have oil importation for generation only would have been reduced by 90%. We'd had a mid-size hydro by 2027. We'd start introducing renewable energy generation into the DBIS starting 2020, and we would reduce the fuel generation for powered by fuel generation by 95% by 2029. Based on that, a timeline was worked out. We said, fair enough, let us bring gas ashore. So we started a site selection. And we anticipated if a site was selected in 2018, there's a pipeline fabrication was started in 2020, pipeline installation in 2021. Commissioning would have been in the first quarter of 2022. And in the interim, we would have procured the dual fuel generators and installed them at the site and run them immediately with HFO. And then obviously as the pipeline comes in, we would transition them over to natural gas. These were the all-in costs in 2018. And the costs that you see here were either prepared by Exxon. These were firm costs that Exxon provided to the government for that. So therefore the pipeline and the plant for 30 MFCD would of course 380 million. As I mentioned before, the power plants would of course 188 million. The site infrastructure and civil work 75 million. And GPL would anticipate they would have to pay $25 million in new transmission and distribution lines and substation. And we did a modeling on the projected costs of the using these numbers, using scenarios, and it was proven that that power could be sold to GPL under 10 cents. It actually was a figure between 4 and 6 cents, as you can see there, as well as the government would have earned revenue from the gas sales, which is the LPG plant. And it was anticipated that you'd have a savings between 0.1 billion to $0.5 billion at $50 US dollars a barrel from when we made the transition. So therefore, most of the idea was obviously just to power the grid because of the deficit, because you had to keep it going, and then we would move on from there and build on top of that base that you had there. The other option obviously would have been just to keep putting HFO sets on the site to ensure to keep up with the demand until hydro and the other renewables kicked in. A site selection committee. These are the local persons that were in the site selection committee. Of course, Exxon was there. EPA was excluded because we wanted no conflict in interest. We asked the site selection committee to give them 5 criteria: land size, was looking for minimum 200 acres, which is for future expansion. Site development costs, obviously, accessibility to utilities, infrastructure, and ports. Then distance and accessibility to FPSO, and then of course our environmental issues. The site selection committee in 2018 examined 10 sites as far as Pomeroon to the west and Blairmont to the east. And the site selection committee proposed an area called Woodlands, which is by Mahaika, just past Mahaika area. As you could see from the initial plan was never ever a grandiose plan. The initial plan was that you identify the area for the power plant, and we would only require approximately 20 to 25 acres. GPL would have constructed a new substation in Collagen, and that would have been the shortest route possible for the. So the initial idea was purely to power the country, keep the country going with a resource which we had, and transition or move over. And then obviously because the data there did not support a long-term industry. And as I showed you what Exxon had up to 2015, they may have adjusted with the other additional point. So in conclusion, The decision was based on DBIS required urgent additional generations. The gas ashore solution was economically viable in a phased developmental manner. The gas was available for 15 to 20 years at that volume without affecting optimum oil production. The all-in cost for every single thing spread over this period was under $700 million. It was determined that this would be an optimum solution for our renewable energy shift. Get the base load and then move on. And based on what we have agreed that 65% of our power generation would be powered by renewable sources as of 2023, we would have been self-sufficient in LNG. At no point in time did we ever consider enough gas, or was it even feasible to do anything on a larger scale, alternative uses of natural gas. Those were other studies. We just had the land in case when those studies did prove successful or not. That is it. So it was purely a power generation issue. Thank you very much. I went a little bit over, but I hope that's okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. No, that was very interesting. So well worth it. Okay, we move now to another recorded presentation, this one from Maurice Veecock, who's a retired hydropower engineer, former senior lecturer in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Guyana. He worked on hydro projects in Guyana for decades and has technical and institutional knowledge. This was recorded at Moray House Trust a few days ago, again, because of the difficulties we've been experiencing with live broadcasts on Zoom recently. So just bear with me while I share this one.
My recommendation are hereby submitted that the best solution is to pursue the development of the Amaila Power Project as a foresight in the Potaro River Basin. Some background information. In order to determine adequately the power potential of the rivers in Guyana, plan approval for monitoring the water resources was introduced in September 1965 due to the establishment of the Hydrometeorological Service to perform measurements. In early 50, Demerara Bauxite Company Limited contracted Aluminum Laboratories of Canada to undertake a feasibility study at Great Falls in Demerara. The study was completed, but the construction was shelved. During the period, the Colonial Development Corporation financed a small hydropower project of 1.5 megawatts in 1956, located at Chumachimari in the Potaro. This venture was a very unhappy one. The dam was never completed, even though the installation of two 0.75 megawatts was installed. Development in the 60s. By the request of the government again for Power Development Survey, the Government Council of the United Nations Special Fund in 1965 approved that Sheminigan Engineer of Montreal was contracted. Two sites were investigated: Tiger Hill on the Demerara River, Tubuku on the Mazun River. These projects were not considered favorable since they failed to attract a smelter power and also the high mill rate of about 5 mills per kilowatt hour. What were the developments in the 70s? The government of Guyana, in its effort to develop its hydropower resources, contracted many consultants during the period 1970 to date. Some of these consultants are, for instance, Norgo engineer and consultant for Uber7, Sweeco, Sweden, Montgomery and Watson has a Chinese consultant, Hardy Stevenson Associates. Right. The government of Guyana applied and received from the UNDP a grant of assistance for carrying out hydroelectric power survey in Guyana. The bank contracted consultant engineer from Montreal Engineering to carry out this survey on behalf of the since it documented the potential of all watershed rivers and recommended as a way forward for power developments in Ghana, considering existing future power requirements, including industrial use. The findings of this study can be condensed as listed below. A. Essequibo River, Arasara, Akwai 346, Patterson 9.8, King William 12, Manaroo 63 megawatt, King George 112. Cayuni River has 9 possible sites, but I list only 3. Camario 100 megawatt, Oko Blue 162, Devil's Hole 62. Mazaruni has the greatest concentration of power potential. There are at least 16 possible sites. Upper Mazuni, right? Kibuku, Tortubo, etc. Let us go to the Patari, which is very important. Patari has a capacity of 1,020 The Amelia hydropower project is centrally located. It has the highest head of 364 meters of other power schemes in Ghana. It has a small reservoir and therefore adequacy of water supply is the main deterrent. However, this problem is not a difficult one to solve, since one may see and recommend an increase in reservoir size, but since meteorological conditions are vital, will not change. Secondly, large reservoir induce seismic activity. For example, the Mazruni hydroelectric problem had the largest reservoir in South America, and we are afraid with that reservoir, induced seismic activity will destroy everything. That is why it was shut. The best solution is to divert water, right, from the Patara upstream of the Kaito Fall. This can be done by installing a way upstream of the Patara River to create a reservoir so as to supplement the low flow in the Amelia Reservoir. Because of the topography in the Kaito Valley, which is higher than the Amelia, the hydraulic gradient will cause flow of water to the Amelia Reservoir. This can be done either through a tunnel, pipe. The next development in the Patara River uh, should be Chai Chai diversion. We will divert water from the Mazruni River at Chai Chai into the Patara River so as to enhance the low flow into the Patara River basin. Right. Some other basic parameters should be noted for the Amelia. The reservoir has a surface area of 23 square kilometers and a minimum operating level to surface about 8.4 meters kilometers square. Based on the output of approximately 165 megawatts, then that storage will only last for 23 days. The storage will be critical during the dry seasons. B. Figures for the Amelia. Powerhouse 165 megawatts. Number of turbines 4. Gross megawatts per unit 41.25. Gross gross output generated was about 165 megawatts. Design flow per unit 12.6 meter cube per second. From the flow duration curve plotted for the Amelia, 25% you will have flow of 83 meters cube per second. 50% of the time you have 46 meter cube per second. And 75% of the time you have 24 meters per second. Average low flow is 8 meters per second, and the lowest flow is 2 meters per second. Generating flow of Amaila using the Q Amaila equal 0.26 Kaishur. Summary date of Monty Flow. September 1951 to April 1952, 8 months, 9 meter cube to 33 meter cube per second. September 1957 to March 1958, 7 months, 9 meters cube to 43. September 1960, May 60 to May 61, 9 months, average flow 42 meter cube to 34 meter cube per second. Viability of Amelia is as a feasible site for hydropower development is hinged on a detailed geographic survey of reservoir site to determine the adequacy of the rock formation to retain water effectively. The final project cost must take into consideration all factors which will affect the design, operation, and maintenance facility. My recommendation, Amelia Falls Hydropower Project is worthwhile, provided that is not undertaken as a standalone project. It is important that adequacy and the reliability of flow of power generation is maintained, and consequently by option to harvest water from the Kaisho must be included as an element in the project. In other words, you have to divert water from the Patara into the Amelia Basin to have reliable flow. The concept of the basin development is more viable option. In order to make the Amelia project the most viable and the first site, you have to have water. You cannot have a larger reservoir because of seismic activity, but you can divert water from the Pataro by a canal or a conduit into that river basin. You will have flow. You will still continue to pour water over the Kaitro Falls, but we will divert some in order that the Amelia Basin will have adequate water. Because we are bringing the power to Georgetown, right? And maybe Linden, I don't know if we're going to smelt, right? So the transmission line will have to cross the Essequibo River, Demerara River. It may be along the Linden Highway. You know, we had all of that. But I'm not getting involved in the transmission line. All those small hydropower that they're doing, we have already studied them, and we were doing that because part of our strategy at that time was to look into areas with have population and try to give the people small hydropower projects. And we had a list of them, which is left in ministry there. All communities in the interior have power schemes that they can develop to service them. We have looked at all those, for instance, King William Falls, right? We can send power to Bonfin, you know. We went all over this country and we located all the sites and we call mini hydropower project to service communities, right? Now, micro and mini. We look at the village and then we look how we can give this village power.
Okay, so that was Mr. Veecock's presentation on Amaila, which we felt it was important to include just to have some kind of informed perspective there. Sadly, he is not able to join the panel. He's post-internet, which is probably no bad thing. Sorry. We are going to move now to an opportunity for the panel to cross-question before we open the floor to questions. So if there is anything that any of the members of the panel would like to raise with each other, this is your chance. Go ahead, please.
Not really. I mean, there's nothing urgent that I would have to raise.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just ask, I think, well, it's unfortunate that Maurice is not here, but Alfred, Simone, yourself. I was trying to highlight the scenario versus where we are in 2015 or where we are in 2020 versus where we want to go. One of the questions that I really would like answered is what would the panel such as yourself, I mean, Alfred, how would you fix the issues that we have now as you are moving towards self-sufficiency? You know what I mean? Because you can't just, I mean, I don't know what you say. You just put a cold stop on generation and then move on. And that is the dilemma I think that is missing when we have the conversation on transitioning to renewable energy. So I just wanted your perspective on how you feel it could be done, because it would be interesting.
Yes, I feel we do not need the gas to shore intermediate. We can go straight to renewable because the world is at that stage. I have clients and I've prepared invoices and we've put in some amount of work in it, and it's clear that solar power is much more favorable. Now the gas to shore, it also lasts. It's going to last as long as the gas is there. So it's going to run out one day. But in the meantime, we would have had this infrastructure. What would become of it? Whereas, my proposal is that there be very many small solar power units. When I say small, I mean 5 kilowatts. Now, recently I read that the government is giving out for $7.2 million US dollars. They're going to provide 30,000 homes with solar power. Now, if you do a calculation with that, and at the price that I work out, $2 per watt, that's going to be just 120 watts per household. With 120 watts, you can't really do anything at this state where the world is now. You've got to get internet and so on. 5 kilowatts, I mean, at home, I operate with half a kilowatt in panels and a 2 kilowatt inverter. And I cut my bill from 12,000 Guyana dollars a month to about 3,000 or 4,000 a month. Just with that. Now, I can't run a washing machine on it because that takes a lot of virtual power, reactive power. So big machines, you will need more. But with 5 kilowatts, I could run anything in my house. And any modern household can run on 5 kilowatts. So 5 kilowatts, in fact, you can even use 3. But I use 5 because I want to see development take place. I insist, we do not need the intermediate of gas.
Well, I won't want to take up our time here. So myself and Alfred can debate that. But I hope you paid attention, Alfred, that at the end of 2020, our existing very, very defunct system, which we have now that is very, very prone to block up. By the end of 2020, we need 70 megawatts of power. And that is not an easy thing to replace, even by what you're saying, by your small thing. But we are no longer, thank you very much. That's all I wanted to.
Okay, could we then
Isabella, I have a question for Mr. Patterson.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Mr. Patterson, I have actually 2 questions for you. The first is, when you were considering the NGL and gas to shore option, were any of those NGL products going to meet a demand in the local market that isn't electricity based? That's the first question. Because of course we're using about 36% of our energy for electricity. And the second one is the cost. The figures that you have put forward for what Exxon provided are significantly lower than the figure that is now in the current Gas to Shore initiative that is being planned. And I am curious to know what is different. What is different in what was planned then and now to account for that cost difference?
Thanks, Simone. On the first one, yes, we were looking at transportation. That's our second biggest energy usage, polluting usage. So therefore, we had commenced studies and seeing that if we could introduce, or if the possibility of introducing public transportation, I mean the big buses or long haul buses, and that can be powered off of LNG or CNG. I can't remember the exact word. So we were looking at using some of the very small quantities, 30 MCFU. So we were not just going to use it for just power alone. What the figures that I have available, and most people have available, is that at 30 million CFD, or even at 50 million CFD, there's not much option and not much more you can do with it. So therefore, we had restricted ourselves, don't get ambitious, and to do anything ambitious as well, it is a stock feed to keep power going, and the byproduct was subscription LPG, and we're looking to use the gas to power. I think Trinidad had done some other countries, Colombia would have done it and power their public transportation, because we have to, as a whole, another conversation, we have to move past our minibuses as public transportation only. So we were, that was at the stage where it was at. And the second question, I really can't answer that, but literally what our goal and focus was gas to power. It was not a grandiose project, as I said. I mean, we were looking at for 200 acres. We were only going to use 25 acres. That's it, to put on the power plants, storage, offices, and then obviously the LPG plant. Maybe, I don't know, and I would like to assume maybe the project that is being done now is on a larger scale for a far bigger scope. So that I know. I know the pipeline cost, that we got from Exxon. I don't know what has driven it up so far, but those were the costs that they provided to us, and it's backed up by Energy Narrative. I mean, as I said, and the study by IDB, and they're all within 10% of each other. So we're pretty confident, because there continues to be, and rightfully so, some sort of distrust if you get a number from the oil producer themselves. And so that's why we took the independent in person. I can't say what it is. Maybe I most likely the scope of the project may have changed, but obviously I'm not involved in that. But as I mentioned, Simone, from between now and mid-2030, the possibilities of the fines that we had was 15 to 17. There are only two of them really that had any possibility of sending gas to shore. And even of the two, we're really talking about somewhere in the range of 2 or 3 TCFs, which isn't a huge amount. So it wouldn't be economically viable to export it or those things. It has to be. So we just limited it, as Alfred is saying, that intermediate piece there, and obviously, and then when we transition to renewable energies with 1 and 2 medium-sized hydros and wind and those things like that, we could do. But we never actually did. I never actually looked at any sort of associated industry other than powering the grid.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we've run over a little bit on our presentations, so I'm keen to just open the floor for questions from the audience for a short period. If you are in the audience, you have a question, do just use the raise your hand icon. I see there are quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to lead with one of those from News Talk Radio, Guyana. Can the panelists weigh in, please, on projected rainfall for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years in Guyana, and how these projections may impact on the viability of investments in hydropower? On the other hand, sorry, it continues. Can you also speak to the projected availability of sufficient sunshine to ensure that there's enough power generation for daytime usage and storage for nighttime usage?
Well, I've been measuring the weather for some years now, and I haven't seen that much change over the years. I've had students at the university study the rainfall and produce projects on it, and it hasn't varied that much. So the hydromet would have the projections, and I think every month they put out a projection. Now the solar power is so dimensioned with storage that within the $2.50 per watt, there is sufficient battery capacity to store 2 consecutive rainy days, energy for 2 consecutive rainy days. And it's rare that we have rain for more than 2 consecutive days. I've been observing the weather for some time, and it doesn't happen very often. I mean, mainly on the coast. Maybe in the interior, perhaps.
Okay, thank you for that. We have, I think, a question from Mr. Trotz. Would you like to go ahead?
Hi, Isabel.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Hi, colleagues in the panel, Alfred, David, everyone. Actually, I was going to ask something related to the last question about weather and the future hydrological regime. In Suriname at the moment, they're experiencing serious challenges with their hydroelectric facility because of the change in weather patterns and the change in the supply of water. They've had long blackouts as a result of the fact that they can't generate energy. So my question was, in planning Amaila, have they taken into account what might be the nature of our hydrological regime as we move forward? That's a very important issue. I see you diverting water from the Kaichor area into Amaila. There's no guarantee that that water from Kaichor is going to be available. Projections are now available about future climate and what is likely to be your rainfall regime. And I think that they must take this into account when they're looking at this type of investment. There are lots of other issues I want to raise, but we don't have the time now. But thank you very much, Alfred. How does one deal with the power for industrial use using the model that you have put forward?
Well, people will have to, the development option should really go to people first. Industry could use the existing infrastructure. David did say that it is going out of, is getting old and has to be replaced. Now we are getting oil. I see that the oil, the liquid oil, could be the stepping stone, could be the intermediate, if necessary. But you know, solar can do industrial work.
Well, that's
All
where
we
I
have
want
to,
to push you.
yes, yeah. What we have to do is compensate with the power factor. Um, um, Electric machines use what is known as reactive power. It's the industrial and commercial people pay for this in terms of demand. It's the equipment that is necessary. Um, Solar power would have to provide that, but it's so cheap that you could put a lot of solar power and pay it back in rail power. Rail power being the thing that does work, whereas reactive or virtual power is the thing that we've got the price we have to pay the electrical machine for operating. So this power factor compensation, I've put in an extra 50 cents into the price of the solar power for 80% power factor. And you could power a lot of machines on solar power. In fact, I've had industries. I was a consultant to the Guyana Manufacturers and Services Association, and they have some industries wanted to go solar. No, I made measurements and advised them, but for some reason they they haven't gone, and I'm no longer in the big time thing. But they were advised that it could be done. Manufacturing concerns could use solar power. They would just have to use up the the demand as real power.
All right, thanks. The thing is, solar is the flavor of the day now with the improvement of battery technology. Recently
Yes.
introduced these iron flow batteries, which are revolutionizing the way we use solar. I just need to leave that on the agenda, but thanks very much, all of you, for the presentations.
Good to hear from you.
Okay, just balancing the different platforms. So Vanda, I see you waiting, and Simone patiently. Question from Facebook from Daryl Nigaki. With regard to the same solar, is there a potential for large scale projects, and how to best propose this to the current government? Which I think you've touched on there. I mean, that may just be one to leave floating.
Yeah, I don't recommend large scale. Let the people, let the industries put it in. Those who require it can put it in. There's going to be a payback. I mean, the Guyana Manufacturers and Services Association, some of those companies already saw that there would be a payback, but for some reason they didn't know how to launch into it.
Okay, thanks. Vanda, you've been waiting very patiently.
Hi, Isabel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for organizing this, and kudos to all of the panelists. Just to say that on my opinion, I do not support the gas to shore. And I think in our own press, there have been numerous and very excellent articles pointing out to the non-viability or the non-good sense of doing this, especially in the global situation that we are, and that Guyana has to we have to contribute to the action against climate change. I also do not agree. I really am very dubious, and I am terrified of the idea of us interfering with Kaicho Falls in any way. So to me, the Amaila Falls has always had the deterrent that it is dry for, I think it's dry right now, but obviously people have taken pictures all through the years, and the people who live near there know that the falls gets dry. So I don't believe that that is really a very sensible option to pursue. I am all for Alfred's proposal for putting power in all senses of the word into the hands of people and householders first. This is not a hard thing to do. We can do this now, and we should be doing it now. There have been endless proposals for incentivizing Guyanese people, householders, up and down the entire country of Guyana in getting the incentives to put the solar panels in place for their needs. My second home is Rupununi, and for instance, ecotourism lodges, one of the biggest is Rock View in Anai, and at any given time, you can have up to 25 people there. It is entirely run with the solar. They have the inverter system, so at night, you have lights all night long because the solar is converted or inverted or whatever it is, but you can put on your switch in the night with the solar there. They're freezers. The freezers are run on solar, as is the Bina Hill Institute, which accommodates up to 60 students residentially. So even in very small ways in Guyana, with small but viable institutions, the solar is working. Right now in Guyana, in the middle of Georgetown, the Demerara Bank runs its main office and all of that on solar. And it has said publicly in the press, when it did this a couple of years ago, that its savings have been tremendous, and they published all of this. There are examples that I know of in Germany, where entire small towns, small industrial towns, are entirely run on solar. We in Guyana really have to change our thinking from, as Albert, all this big time this and big time that, and messing up our waterfalls and everything else, and begin to do what can be done just by us, the people. How hard can that be? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Vanda. Simone.
I would like to, in fact, at this point, respond to everyone, really. The question that came from the news channel about the weather patterns and what can we expect from hydro. First of all, we know from the models, the climate models, that we will experience more likely periods of very intense rainfall and floods, and then periods of dry spells. So it's not so much what we're really going to be seeing as predicted is not so much a question of the even rainfall that we used to have, but times when it's just so intense it leads to flooding and then a dry spell. Now, the question about water for the dam, for the Amaila Falls Dam, is a very relevant one, especially when it comes to diverting water that's being used by hinterland communities and for other reasons, and ecologies of fish, etc., and animals that will be affected. And it gets to my point that I opened with. We are not in a position to answer what is the correct energy mix because we have not assessed all of the factors as yet. And we need to do this. Now, your question about weather patterns is also relevant to gas to shore. If you look at our climate projection, the flood zone from rising sea levels from the next 12, 20, 30 years, that entire flood zone is where we're proposing to put down multi-million-dollar infrastructure. So that is a serious upset condition, not only for the toxic materials that will be spread around, but also the operation of those facilities. And that flooding isn't just a risk from the sea. Because of the changing pattern of flooding with rainfall, it's also a risk from land. So that gets to this whole question of, is this really a decision about how we're going to power our house or our car? No. It's a fundamental decision that where everything is interconnected. It's about our development. It's about our culture, our social effects, the economic effects, the environmental effects, all of which affect each other at the end of the day. So that's the answer to the question on drought. And the second point I want to make concerns solar energy. What I noticed in the studies, and Mr. Patterson can correct me if I'm wrong, all of those studies work on an assumption that solar energy or renewable energy would be kept at a certain level. Now, this is really important because I haven't seen an assessment that actually puts all the options next to each other and considers that solar technology will be improving as time goes by, that it's going to get cheaper, that we're going to have more access, that we may address issues of large grid needs, etc. So a lot of the assumptions on the study are biased towards the particular options that are being looked at in those studies. And again, my point is, until we have a comprehensive assessment looking at a whole series of criteria, nobody is in a position right now, no politician, no policymaker, no civil servant, no citizen is in a position right now to make a rational decision that is responsible towards the people of Guyana. We need the assessments, we need the public ventilation of them, and our parliament is responsible for ensuring they happen and that we are engaged in a conversation and we understand what choices are being made for us.
Okay, thank you for that, Simone. There is a question in the feed about the Mazaruni Basin and why it was ruled out as a site for a hydropower station. I'm just going to answer that based on Mr. Veecock's presentation and then defer to the panel who know far more about it. But what he said was that it was ruled out because they felt that the weight of all the water, it's an enormous basin. They felt that the weight of the water might induce seismic activity. So as I say, I defer to the panel, but that was what Mr. Veecock said in his presentation.
Just to summarize quickly, the Mazaruni Basin, there's a study, it's ongoing right now called Aquanorte. That is a study that is been ongoing, it's funded by the IDB, it's been ongoing for the last 10 years. And it's an idea whereby we can construct the Mazaruni Basin and power Brazil, Venezuela, Suriname, and onward. But the challenge is the basin, the size of the basin that's needed. It's all inhabited. I mean, it's not virgin. It's not virgin. There are communities. I think there are law cases. I know for sure Mr. Hughes, Nigel Hughes, are representing some of the Aqueo tribes, because that's part of their ancestor home as well. So it has huge social and environmental challenges if that's what ever to come off. They have tried to reduce it, but that also still has a lot of challenges. So on top of the technical stuff with the size of the basin, the size of the weight of the water and the geological issues, it is an environmental and social challenge, which as Simone is saying, do we want to get into a project of that size? So it's a discussion, just as Simone is saying, that we should have, is it worth it to the people of Guyana?
Thank you for that. Mr. Jailal's been waiting very patiently. Do go ahead.
Yeah, this question is for former Minister Patterson. Mr. Patterson, your government was leaning towards Mahaika as the site for the Gas Ashore project. And I think they were projecting a cost of 500 million. And the current government says they have used studies conducted by your government and they have chosen Wales instead at a cost of 900 million. Do you have any insight as to why there is that big difference? And why they chose Wales versus Mahaika?
Right, Jerry. So they have released all 5 studies. I was just looking at them, and I can't answer that because if you read it, the issue about Wales is obviously it has some severe challenges. They've tried to mitigate it by going on land. I don't know if that helped. I mean, Exxon is just giving you enough information. I'm sure, I would like to assume that that the additional studies were done, but they haven't released it. They only released the ones that would have done under my ministry. That does not lend to the project at Wales, nor does it lend to the costs in which they're attributed. And you, just for the record, Isabel and everyone, the $900 million is just for the pipeline and the gas plant. That's the same, and Exxon had said to us that would cost $344 million landed at Cronbrook or Woodlands. You now have to do all the other, as I said in my summation, which I did there. You have to buy the generators now. You have to do the civil infrastructure and those things like that. You have to storage. You have to store just in case, as somebody mentioned, if there is a shortage of gas or accidents or something like that, you must be able to keep those units running. So you have to store on. So the numbers is 900 million is only numbers which Exxon, I think, because of their public transparency issues, had to declare it, and they declared 900 million. On none of the studies up to 2019, not one of the studies indicated such a high cost, but I would like to assume that there's additional information which may come out in time why it is written so far, maybe geotechnical or some sort of environmental issue, but I can't say at all.
Okay.
But just allow me to, I think somebody else wants to speak. Yeah.
Yes. Simone, did you want to make further comment? I see your hand up.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't take.
That's fine. Okay, we're going to take one final question or comment, and then if the panel would like to make any closing remarks. We have now been going for nearly 2 hours, which is a long time. Danuta, was there something you wanted to add?
Okay, it's a question to Simone. I wanted to, she spoke about the energy mix, and at the moment there's not, enough information, and that dialogue is not going on really. But the truth is, these projects are going ahead. So when would be the time for these conversations to take place? Because we're full speed ahead in Guyana on oil exploration, on oil drilling, on gas to shore, on the Demerara Bridge, many, many things in which there are no EIAs, there is no national discussion going on there, and there is no space for a national discussion. So how will that happen? What is needed for us to be able to have a national discussion? I mean, this is a small, a small meeting. We have, I don't know, a few people here, more people on Facebook, but where and when and under what conditions are we going to have that national dialogue, or will we never have it? Because I see no attempts, to do this, even though the Constitution says this, etc. And successive governments have not done this. The resources of Guyana belong to the people of Guyana. They do not belong to political parties. They do not belong to governments. They belong to the people. But it seems as if our governments do not understand or do not, make attempts for a national dialogue to be held on these things, because it will affect the welfare of Guyanese people, their health, the welfare of our environment, etc. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to invite the panel if anyone has any closing remarks they'd like to make, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yes, all right. I'll go in first, unless I'll defer to This has been a very, very interesting panel, meaning very diverse. And I do think it's we should you can do it again in smaller segments, because there are issues which we haven't touched on. Our audience may go with the impression that say solar route of house software is the answer. There are issues with what is called grid stability studies, and which is basically the variable power that how much a grid can take when power varies. And I just give a very general example. It is not recommended to have more than 25% of your power of your grid in one particular type of variable power. So say, for example, a dark cloud just comes over the city. All of your solar panels will be affected equally, and that would cause an immediate drop in the amount of power supplied to unless everyone has batteries and those things, which are quite extent. So there is a energy mix, as Simone was saying, whereby you should only have like 20% of it solar recommended, 20% wind, and that makes it up. So therefore, one single factor, say, as I said, a volcano goes off, you have an ash cover, that one single factor doesn't bring your grid down. So that's one of the issues that we should have to speak about. And I see, and I also would like as well, if you can send some of the questions that you have there, because some of them are unanswered, and if, maybe on your Facebook feed, we can provide a written response to some of them. That would be helpful, because I don't want anyone to think how they sent in questions that weren't answered. So once again, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to having a wider discussion generally on the energy mix. Thank you.
Thank you. Simone, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Sure. I think that Danuta actually posed a very good closing question, which is, where do we go from here? We've identified some issues, but quite correctly, we are not able at this point in time to convince our government to treat our constitution with the regard that we deserve, and to have a national consultation on our development plan. And we have found ourselves in a position where on a daily basis, piecemeal information comes out, and we really are not even honoring the Environmental Protection Act, which requires us to consult when there are such major shifts. So where do we go from here? Two big gaps. One is in recognizing the importance of having this national conversation and crafting and improving on our development strategy as it exists now, and filling the gaps in information that's required to do it. I believe Parliament is the body that is responsible to all of us, and being able to pursue this at the parliamentary level is perhaps the next step. And I also want to say thank you to everyone, and to Alfred especially, for the matrix that you used, where you were actually beginning to do what would be very good to see in a comprehensive assessment. Put the different options side by side and assess them along a set of variables. So perhaps the next step is to build from the information gathered here, and to flesh out that matrix, see where the gaps are, and perhaps to move towards a request to Parliament to honor the consultative process and to disclose the relevant information. I think that's probably something we can do as citizens in going.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Bhulai, any closing remarks?
Yes, thank you, Moray House, for having me and having this discussion. This is the discussion that we should be having, that the government is not, as well recognized, is not facilitating. It's private citizens like us who are concerned about the way our country in the direction it's going, we have to take this initiative. I just like to summarize the solar power. I'm very amenable to questions. I have these things calculated out, and of course, in a forum like this, it's difficult to justify things. But I'm willing to present those calculations to anyone who asks anything specifically. My email can be made available. Moray House could do so. The solar power I'm thinking of is not the grid tie type, where I am quite well aware that if a cloud comes over and it's going to cause a great instability in the limited supply that we have. I know that. That is why the proposal, my proposal is for what is known as island operations, self. You know. So, I mean, I'm imagining we can start with those places where they don't have electricity, and then move into the city gradually. I mean, the built up places already have some infrastructure, and industry is already going on. But as time goes by, everything in solar power is getting cheaper. I wrote a letter about 2014, about 7 years ago, and I at that time was advocating solar power at $5 per watt. Well, by 2019, the technology developed where we have high voltage solar power now, and it makes distribution much simpler. And it's a plug-and-play type. There's no high tech. I mean, ordinary people can learn to plug in, connect, and of course, got to do it carefully. But the way the machines, the equipment is designed, only certain plugs go in certain places. Those of you who put together computer parts would know that. You can't, and it's difficult to make a mistake because only a certain plug would fit.
Yeah.
So it's becoming easier and cheaper.
Okay. Right. Well, it just remains for me to thank the panel very much for agreeing to participate and for doing, I think in each case, a considerable amount of preparatory work for the presentations. I realized they were technical, but actually this is where the conversation needs to start, I think, with the technicalities. And then when we have a sort of reasonably firm grasp of those, then we can move on to the other aspects. I think it's clear that, as I said at the beginning, this is an enormous topic, and it is constantly shifting itself. I am in the UK at the moment, and they are in the process of exiting gas and finding the energy balance, so the wind and the other things, finding it very difficult to calibrate that mix. So the mix is not something that's static and you get there and you stay there. The mix is constantly evolving. And I think we also have to be kind of, you know, to realize that we may not get to that halcyon point, but obviously there are different routes. So this is the beginning of I think, a series of conversations about this. And I hope that it will be had in other fora as well. I mean, Moray House Trust is committed to these kinds of conversations, but you know, they need to be had across the board. So thank you very much. We had quite a small audience tonight. I have a feeling we're going to gather. We had some on Facebook as well, and I have a feeling we'll gather a bit of momentum as people look at this in their own time. Very grateful to you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. If you have any pressing questions, please do send them into Moray House Trust and we will relay them to the speakers. And I will use Mr. Patterson's suggestion and forward any unanswered questions in the chat to the panel. So thank you again. Yes, until the next one. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you very much. Good night.
All right. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Simone. Good night.